Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd just like to thank our ISO Show listeners for tuning in to the ISO Show. As you know, I started this podcast just about a year ago now, actually. It's our 1-year anniversary. And we started it to dispel myths around ISO standards and to get away from the theory that it's just about ticking boxes. And I've been really grateful for all of our guests on the show and also consultants here at Blackmores that have kindly been involved with the interviews that I've done to share tips and ideas on how to improve ISO standards and implement management systems. And I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all of our listeners. I can't believe we've had over 4,000 listeners tune in across the globe, so not just in the UK, but internationally as well. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our awesome ISO listeners. And also just to say very quickly that we really do appreciate your feedback and your reviews and ideas on future topics. So we will be featuring those. One of the ones that's come up quite recently is on carbon footprint verification and carbon offsetting. So we will be featuring that in a future episode. So please do keep those suggestions and ideas and reviews coming. We really do appreciate every single one of them. So I'd like to introduce our guest today, Tony Bennett from Kingsley Napley, which is a leading law firm in London. And what I'm going to do now is just introduce you to Tony. So I'd like to welcome our guest today, Tony Bennett, who's the Senior Information Security Executive at Kingsley Napley. And he's going to be sharing with us his journey on something that he's just recently achieved, which is certification to ISO 9001 for quality, ISO 27001 for information security, and ISO 22301 for business continuity. So it's a hat trick that he's recently achieved certification for all three standards for a leading law firm called Kingsley Napley. So without further ado, hello, Tony.
Hi Mel, thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Great to have you. Could we just begin by you sharing a bit about Kingsley Napley, please? What does the organisation do in a bit more detail?
Sure. Kingsley Napley is a law firm. We're based in the City of London. We've been going since 1937, so quite a long-established, prestigious firm. We were set up by a gentleman called Sir David Napley. So yeah, it's a very prestigious organisation to work for. We're a sort of a mid-sized law firm. We're top 70 in terms of legal rankings. We've got about 400 employees. And what's quite unique about us is we're very diverse. So we've got 11 different practice areas of law that we cover, which makes it a very sort of challenging organisation to work in, because you've always got to consider all the different practice areas of law whenever you try and affect change to an organisation like this. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge. And yeah, looking forward to sharing a bit more about it with you.
Excellent. Before we begin, could you share with us something that not many people know about you, Tony?
Yeah, so in 2017, I was part of the team that won the Formula One Constructors World Championship. So I worked for the Mercedes Formula One team, actually just before joining Kingsley Napley. And we was lucky enough to win a Formula One World Championship, which is obviously a fantastic thing. It was a great experience, probably one of the best experiences of my life, actually. And obviously something that's obviously very nice to carry with you through life and a nice story to tell people.
Awesome. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Thanks for sharing that with us. And in terms of your role at Kingsley Napley, could you share with us a bit more information about that? And what do you do on a day-to-day basis? And what are your key responsibilities?
So, yeah, I joined Kingsley Napley 2 years ago, as I said, after leaving the Formula One team. And I was brought into the organisation to develop the information security and business continuity infrastructure, if you like. So as a law firm, lawyers are expected to keep information confidential. So there's always that overriding thing you have in law. But the organisation felt they needed a bit more sort of structure to that, and hence I came along. GDPR helped that as well. That was also part of my responsibilities. But I guess at the highest level, it is bringing structure and development to the information security process and implementing a business continuity program as well. developing on top of what we already had in the organisation.
Okay, and so I mentioned earlier about the hat trick, the 3 standards that you just achieved certification for. What was the main driver behind selecting certification to those particular standards, Tony?
I think there's a couple of things really. There's the internal and the external factors. Now, internally, obviously I'm a big believer in implementing formal programs to develop, these particular areas. I feel they really help develop organisations and bring them along in their maturity life cycle up to a standard where, in a couple of years, they probably wouldn't have achieved if we hadn't gone down that formal route. But really the external factor that drove it is tenders and contracts. So as an organisation, we were seeing other law firms certify. We were seeing tenders requesting the formal standards, especially 27,000 and 22,301. And that specifically drove us down the route to actually go for these 3 standards at once. I think ordinarily we would have selected individual standards, but because of the requirements that are being placed on us externally, we were seeing these 3 standards coming up quite frequently. We felt we needed to get all 3 and we needed to do them quickly, and we got them all at once.
Fantastic. Yeah, so that's been implemented as an integrated business management system then, has it?
Yes, it has. So we made the decision to integrate standards, obviously with the help of Blackmores, on the discussions I had with our consultant, Rachel. We felt the best approach was to integrate. And that was because we could add some continuity between the shared documents and the shared elements of the management system. And whilst, there's a significant amount of work to produce that integration at the start, we felt in the long run that would help us deliver the management system because it would be easier to manage and easier to function over a longer period.
So in terms of the period for implementation, how long did that take then from the beginning, from the gap analysis through to the final assessment?
It was about 12 months, which is fantastically fast for delivering 3 standards. That was driven by there's internal projects we're doing, but also external factors. So I was talking about tenders and contracts. Specifically, we wanted to achieve the standards by a certain date for specific tenders and contracts. But equally, we wanted to have that done, prior to some big projects we got going on internally. So, for example, we've just rolled out a new document management system. We've got a big move coming up. So we needed to have this process done before that as well. And I think we delivered actually quite fast and quite smoothly in terms of the time frame we did for this project.
Yes, I think especially when you mentioned that you've got so many practices within the organisation, it's not like it's just kind of one service delivery, is it? There are multiple service deliveries within the organisations. So yes, obviously needed a collaborative approach as well for working internally with key stakeholders, as well as obviously with Rachel from Blackmores to partner up with as well. So that's great. So what would you say are the positive aspects then from a law firm's perspective in having quality and risk management systems in place?
I think there's the obvious one of it providing confidence to the clients. Whenever you're dealing with a client in a legal capacity, confidentiality, integrity and availability of the information that we hold for them is key to the services being delivered. Whether that's conversations with the client or them sending us information or us taking information to the court or just generally handling it internally, it has to be handled in that very secure, efficient way. And with, the way courts are and dates being set for trials, etc. If we take our criminal practice, for example, as a good example of this, to ensure we have a continuance of service, i.e. delivering our ISO 22301 standard for business continuity, is key to the organisation functioning. And it really gives confidence that, if you give us data and you contract us as a law firm to work for you, then we're always going to be there and we're always going to be able to deliver because we have these processes and these management system and that backbone in the background just supporting the core business, which is obviously providing legal services.
So I think the point there is it's not just about high quality standards and risk management as far as information security and GDPR is concerned, but it's having that resilience, isn't it, to always be there, to always be available, because obviously that's critical for IT infrastructure, isn't it, to support
it's about
the lawyers and paralegals, etc., and administrators.
Yeah, indeed. It's about driving that real business benefit, that business impact. I think additionally, the centralized risk management process is very good. Now, as a law firm, we have certain obligations placed on us by the SRA to look at, risks of the organization, to do a whole number of things and checks. And the management system really helps support that as well. So I'm working closely with our general counsel to liaise with him around our SRA requirements and how they work with the management system as well. So it really supports our regulatory alignment as well as delivering some, real business impact change as well.
Excellent. So it helps to kill two birds with one stone, in effect, really, doesn't it? It sounds as though the two requirements aren't divorced. They're working together, which is great as one system of governance and compliance. So let's go back to the implementation then. So where did you begin with the implementation of the policies and procedures that you needed to have in place? Because a lot of businesses that haven't implemented standards before might be quite daunted by implementing one standard, such as ISO 9001. But then, you've gone for the 9, the 27 and the 22301 in one hit. And I believe you're the first law firm to actually do that. Is that right, Tony?
Yeah, I think we're the first to do it. Certainly the first to do it as an integrated management system and deliver all three at the same time, simultaneously.
Which is quite some achievement. So congratulations on that. Yeah,
very
So let's just go back to the implementation. Where did it all begin then? How did you kick it all off?
So we kicked it all off with, ironically, a kick-off meeting. We pulled together the core group, and where we started was communicating. We communicated with the business as to why we was doing it. So we looked to get a key stakeholder from each of our practice areas who have an interest in risk management. So we pulled those together. We took one from each practice area and one from each support team. We had the senior management as the core team, and then we had myself and Rachel working as the internal team, if you like. I think the key place to start was communicating why we're doing it. Now, for some practice areas, that message was much easier to understand because it directly related to their tenders. And for others, we do additional communications to make sure they understood it. But everyone got on board quite quickly. I think whenever I do one of these implementations, and this is one of a number of organisations I've worked in and done it with, also one of a number I've worked with Blackmores on as well. I always find there's a few different groups of people. You have your general staff, if we group them in sort of general staff. You have sort of your mid-level management, your senior management, and then your core internal stakeholders. And I always find that the easiest people to get on board are the very, very senior members of the organisation. Now, that could be through sort of the good communications we're doing or the way we articulate it to those senior members. But generally, quite quickly, those people will get on board. And once they're on board, it really helps support the management system and what you're doing. I think it's key if you're ever implementing the management system, you have to have that management board level support. Otherwise, it's sort of doomed to fail from the start, if you like. I think the next group, the mid-level management, they're always the ones that need more convincing. And that's not necessarily because they don't understand or they're against the management system, but when you're implementing, that's where the operational change is going to be. It's going to be on those teams, on those mid-level managers. That's where, if you're going to create any additional work, you're going to create it. So how you handle those communications, I think, is key, and a very, very, something you have to do right at the start, and you have to do it well. And then obviously you have to implement a core internal team. So, usually that's myself and working with consultancies such as Blackmores to really help push the message around the organisation. And generally then the general staff will just get on board with the process. And I think once you've managed that first initial couple of weeks of doing that, then you can actually start to get stuck into, the core clauses, if you like, of the management system. But that communication piece and that initial implementation and communication is key.
That's great advice, Tony. Yeah. So communication is a key, is the message. And that's where it all begins before you even start delving into policies and procedures then and getting everybody on board. So thanks very much for that tip. That's really useful. So going on then, could you just share with us a bit more about your journey in implementing the standards?
Yeah, I think it was generally a good journey. I think with any implementations, you've come up against challenges along the way. I think our biggest challenge internally was the diversity in our practice areas. So although we're only an organisation of 400 people, we're an incredibly diverse organisation that will manage client relationships and types of works in very different ways, just in between different practice areas, just by the nature of the work. So for example, an immigration case where, somebody's applying for a visa is a very, very different process to, representing someone at a criminal trial that, may take a couple of years to come to fruition. So I think through our journey, understanding the different practice areas was key to us. We took steps to meet with each practice area to document their core processes in those practice areas. And then from that, we began to build the management system around it.
So just looking at that in further detail then, you mentioned about understanding the different areas within the business. So that's one of the starting points, isn't it, when you're looking at developing quality management procedures and controls, because nobody else will know the processes better than those process owners. But quite often, those processes aren't always articulated, or, they're not necessarily documented. So they're not necessarily communicated within the team. So it's really important to understand everything that happens within each department and how that all, plays a part in exceeding clients' expectations in terms of service delivery. But I guess it's only really once you've done that, then you can then look at, well, how does information flow when we're looking at information security?
Yeah, certainly. I think understanding those processes was key, like I said before, getting into any kind of policy development, any kind of sort of core elements, I guess, of the standards. But as part of our GDPR process, prior to doing this, we looked at the data flows in the departments, I think, which was a really useful thing, and actually probably a lesson learned for me and the organisation. If we was ever to do a different standard or another organisation many years down the line, working through those information flows for GDPR actually allowed us to find out where all of the data was coming from, where it then went within the organisation, who handled it, what third parties we sent it to, and having that information to feed into the process mapping we did actually then really supported some of the information security controls that we're putting around that data. So if anyone was looking at 27001 and they haven't done proper data privacy impact analysis for GDPR, I would urge them to have a look at that and go down that route and literally list out what you're looking at, what data there is, down to, list it to names and addresses, whether it's credit card details, whether it's, sensitive data, health data. Because we're a law firm, obviously we handle the full spectrum of data and sensitive data, so it's key to get those processes right. And just map it out, look at it, who touches it, where all the touch points are in the organisation. And then you start to pick up on some shadow IT. I mean, you may have a system that you didn't think stores data that actually stores it in a database, somewhere out the way that you didn't realise. And then you can pick that up as part of your information security controls and make change and actually secure that avenue because you don't need it going there.
That's a great tip then. So taking on board all of the work that you'd already done in GDPR and kind of feeding that into the 27001 process. Yeah, excellent. And how did you find implementing 22301 then, the business continuity standards? Was it a kind of, you do the quality and information security and then business continuity last almost? So once you've got an understanding of the processes, the risks, and then we're looking at the dependencies and who and what you're reliant on for delivering services?
So once we did the process mapping and the understanding of the organisation, we then looked at business impact assessments, which for the uninitiated are documents that get the client or the user to document what dependencies they rely on upon the business. So as an example, as an information security I may rely on our document management system, I may rely on my laptop, I may rely on my emails. And just understanding what the impact would be to that department if those things were suddenly taken away. And doing that allows us to understand actually what our recovery needs to be in a continuity exercise. So documenting what our recovery time objective would be, our recovery point objective would be, based on what the business is telling us that the impact would be. And now obviously you have to balance that with risk and cost to make sure you come up with an appropriate plan for your business. It really gives you a picture.
Sorry to interrupt you there, Tony. Talking about cost, I guess it's quite easy to be able to quantify the loss of time within a law firm because you're charging by the hour or possibly by the minute? I don't know. How did you find that aspect of it? Was that quite easy to be able to quantify the potential loss of time?
I think it was easy to quantify the potential loss of time, like you say, because in a law firm, billing is tightly controlled, and it is, in factors of minutes that you bill by in a law firm. So, yeah, I mean, it was quite easy to understand it. So for Praxaria said they were, if this happened, they would lose their service for 2 hours. You could then quantify at the time, and therefore obviously the liability and factor into the risks of the organisation in doing that. So it was something that was fairly easy. The more difficult thing was the intangibles. In law, obviously reputation is a huge aspect of a law firm. A law firm with a good reputation is someone that generally attracts clients. So the tough part was quantifying those intangibles. So if we lost service for 2 days, what would be the impact of the reputation? And, you come up with a process and a formula of doing that, which it has some approximations in it, but hopefully gives you a good indication of what the impact of the reputation would be. So in the scenario where we was about to represent a big case, if suddenly we lost all of our systems and we couldn't do that and it was a very high profile case, reputational impact would be huge. But if we had a power outage for an hour, for example, and it just affected our support teams, it would probably be quite minor.
Okay, so it's putting it all into perspective then, really, isn't it? And again, linking it back to risk management.
Yeah, exactly. It's making sure you've got a solid risk management process and you're feeding all the data you're gathering from your impact assessments, your process analysis, even to your information asset risk assessment that you're doing for 27001 into that to make sure you're getting a usable output. And that's something Blackmores really helped us with, actually, the risk management process, just defining actually what would be good for our type of business.
Now, sometimes it's good to have a fresh pair of eyes, isn't it? I mean, I know you've got a lot of experience in this as well, Tony, but sometimes it is good to have a fresh pair of eyes as well, and just kind of, looking at it from a different perspective in some cases, and even just acting as a bit of a sounding board, really.
I find that. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I find that as one of the huge parts of having a consultancy working with us. Like you say, obviously I've got a lot of experience. I've done this in other organisations, but having that sounding board to work with and creating a dynamic team that, you challenge each other's ideas and therefore hopefully come up with a better result than what you would do if you was in isolation.
Well, I know that we could talk about these standards all day, and I'm sure that there's definitely a future podcast there around some of those standards that you've been involved with, Tony. But if we just jump ahead to the assessment, what was that like? Could you, for an ISO show listener that hasn't experienced an assessment for one standard, let alone 3, could you just share a bit about that experience?
I found it a fairly enjoyable process because we put a lot of work into coming up to the assessment. So once you get to that point, I find it quite enjoyable, and what the auditors are going to be looking at is going to be very good. So it's quite enjoyable. For someone that hasn't done it before, it can be a hugely daunting experience. I know there was members of our organisation who were, quite worried about the audit, not because they're not used to talking to people or not used to that kind of formal level meeting, but just purely because it was an unknown. You take a very experienced lawyer that's used to dealing in a certain area of law and working in a certain way and say, oh, actually, you've got to go into this audit. And that's going to be quite a challenge because, they've not experienced it. And really it's to put, their minds at rest. It's creating communications and talking to them just to help them understand that process. And for me, it's getting them to understand that it's a human level conversation, and the auditors aren't looking to dig until they find non-conformance. They're auditing for conformance to the standard. And generally, there'll be some good feedback that comes with anything they do find. And it's making people aware that if something is found, it isn't the end of the world. There is time to correct it, and it is a constructive exercise. It feeds into the continuous improvement process.
Absolutely, because if there's a new process that you've introduced within the organisation, it's like if you're implementing some new software into an organisation, there are bound to be 1 or 2 little teething problems until it's fully established and everybody's empowered, to take responsibility for those procedures. So it's inevitable that with any new system, there will be some bumps along the way, but it's good to be able to identify those, isn't it? And to be able to manage them effectively, learn from them.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely learning from them is one of the key aspects of this. And I think some people were worried that they would cause a complete failure of the audit if a non-conformity was found. And it's articulating to people as well what, obviously an observation, a non-conformity and a major non-conformity is. And that, a a minor non-conformity that would be picked up during a general process audit, in most cases is not going to be a major non-conformity. That's obviously a complete failure of the management system. And generally that puts people's minds at rest. Because of our very long audit process, it was 11 days of audits on site, most of those days with 2 auditors, so well over 100 hours of auditing. The people who went first were then able to share their experiences in the organisation with the people who were going later on in the process to be audited. I think that's a very good thing to do as well. So if you do have the luxury, and it's probably the only time I'm ever going to call an audit that long a luxury. If you do have,
not the word that's come to mind. Yeah.
If you do have the luxury of a long audit, then utilising that to your advantage is the best thing you can do, where you can get people to share their experiences internally. And then hopefully the people who go later in the audit process are even more confident than what they would have been if they went earlier on.
That's brilliant advice, Tony. Thank you for that. And so just finally, what did you learn along the way that would benefit others? So obviously I know that you've been on a similar kind of journey before with other standards, but what would you say that you learned along the way with this particular project that others could benefit from?
I think it's the challenge that came from the diversity of the organisation. So I've delivered ISO standards in much bigger organisations, and I've actually found the process a bit more straightforward because you're generally working with one type of work or maybe 2 types of work that the organisation focuses on. But when doing it in an organisation that's quite diverse, I think making sure you've got the right support and you've got the right buy-in from those diverse areas is key, because how an immigration lawyer keeps information confidential inherently might be different to someone in corporate and commercial, for example, because of the way they handle their client relationships. So you have to make sure the management system, especially when it comes to the security controls, works for both parties, and how they're expecting to share information going forward can be factored into the management system, for example. So it's just making sure if you've got an incredibly diverse organisation, you're really understanding each area and each area's needs, and then how you can work that into the management system. But again, obviously keeping true to work into a single process and work into a single program of standards.
Which I think that just brings us back to where you began with communication being really key and really understanding the organisation and getting under the skin. So it sounds as though that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, certainly.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Tony, for sharing your experience and all those hints and tips with us today. I'm sure for any organisation that's embarking on implementing these 3 standards, that'd be like gold dust. So I really appreciate that. And also look forward to welcoming you back to the ISO show, hopefully in the future, to share a bit more. Great, because I'm sure that there's lots of other nuggets of information in there that, our ISO show listeners would really value and appreciate. So thanks very much for joining us today, Tony.
That's all right. Thanks very much, Mel.
For further information on Kingsley Napley, there will be a link in our show notes on the Blackmores website. So that's www.blackmoresuk.com. And once again, thank you very much for listening. And we would love to hear from you if you have any other suggestions on future topics and would like to leave a review. So thanks very much for listening. And I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.